Hi everyone, good morning and welcome to Northern Institute's People Policy Place Seminar Series for 2021. Firstly, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. For Northern Institute in Darwin, it is the Larrakia, and for Professor Verran is today presenting on the land of the Wurundjeri. We pay our respects to the Larrakia and Wurundjeri elders past, present and emerging, and further extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Welcome everyone. Just a reminder before I cross over to Professor Verran that there will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. And any questions should be added via the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, which you'll see down the bottom of the screen. I can remind you about that at the end. So let's now cross over to Professor Verran. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Katrina. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and greetings from this land of the Wurundjeri, in which I sit gratefully. And let me, first of all, I'll outline the sections of my talk, and then I'll draw attention to the very last paragraph of my description, just so that we get a sense of what we're in for here. So the talk has 4 sections, and I'm going to start with a brief history of the look at the, if you like, the landscape, the lie of the land in the Australian, it's now called the higher ed section, or used to be called advanced education. And I'll do a quick sort of historical overview. The point of that, of course, is to recognise that things have changed. They are changing, and they'll certainly change in the future. And so it's a matter of sort of working out what the situation is now. Okay, then I'll have a brief think about concepts, because concepts, the idea of concepts is quite important in the last section of the talk. And I'll move on to thinking about disciplinary and interdisciplinary ways of going about things, or what could be called disciplinary and generic forms of epistemic practice, because they are different. And, you know, we do need to get our head around that in this day and age. And then I'll go on to think about data and concepts, which, as far as I can see, is what really matters in getting your head around what data is, all sorts of data, and how we interrogate it with concepts, and also vice versa. And it's that vice versa that is quite important. Okay, so the final paragraph of my talk outline said that I'll focus on the idea of analytic concepts, and I'll discuss how tensions between the forms of empirical data that you have and the acknowledgement that the concepts that you're using to interrogate that data are themselves emergent and complex and undergoing change, just like the situations that your data in a way represents rather than represents, is the way I'm looking at it. So the data, in a way, is another form of the complex social, environmental, political situations that your data is presenting. and how you put those in conversation, that is what really matters in coming up with a Q1 article. Okay, so let me think about the history. And I've got some notes on the side here, so I'll be starting with them. So it's changed in Australia, this higher education landscape that we have. And it's not like it's been invisible change to those of us who've spent our lives in the academy. I know I'm one of the most fortunate person in that I started working in the academy, actually in a science faculty when I was in my early 20s, and I've worked in universities ever since. So this is a very fortunate life. And it's changed. The landscape that the university inhabits has changed quite noticeably, even to me as a fairly sort of ordinary participant. I'm not organising universities or departments or anything, and never have, but just as a teacher, as a researcher, the change really in the way people think about knowledge, what knowledge is used for, how it's valued, and by whom and for what, that has changed. And we need to sort of take note of that. So we do need to get a sense of this bigger picture. And of course, we all know disciplinary practices or disciplines have decreased in importance as the time's gone on, and interdisciplinary forms of research are, really strongly favoured now. In universities, by governments who fund universities, although there's a slight mismatch here in that a lot of the stronger publications do go back to disciplinary origins, and they do value those disciplinary origins. So in a way, universities as institutions have changed more than the publishing of the most reputable forms of sort of knowledge making. And what universities and governments are increasingly interested in is how knowledge can inform policy, but it's more than that. It's how knowledge actually can translate into financial value. So in this, what we've had in the last year or probably since the 70s, is the growth of what's called the knowledge society, or the knowledge economy, not so much used now. And the person most associated with this is an academic called Peter Drucker, who you may or may not have heard of, but he's really the person most associated with this emergence of the idea of there being knowledge workers, and we in universities being knowledge workers, and thinking of what it is we produce as outputs, and so it's really his thinking. So it's worth going and sort of reading some of his. He lived from 1909 to 2005. He trained as an economist, in Vienna. After the First World War, he found work in Germany. And, you know, he came from that part of Viennese society, so that his family knew Schumpeter and Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. So these are the Viennese economists inventing neoliberalism that came to triumph starting from the 70s. And Drucker, who went to England in 1933 and then to America in 1943, his big sort of slogan was that modern industrial society is constituted by large-scale organisations, and businesses are the first and foremost sorts of large corporations that should be recognised. Things like government departments and civil organisations really are just copies of businesses. So he really valued this idea of the business as the exemplary large organisation that all organisations ought to mimic. And so any modes of analysis appropriate to social and political analysis ought to be first and foremost developed for business, and then later and then worked in other government and non-government organisations. And so, and he developed this idea of knowledge as something that workers generate as valuable. So knowledge workers generate valuable product outcomes. Okay, so this is an ideology, if you like, that's around knowledge that's developing starting in the 1970s. And if we come back and look at Australia and the way it responds to this, it's for the first 50 years of the Australian Federation, education, including universities, they're located in the states. They're state business. Universities have considerable autonomy. They name things any which way. They don't really try to work with each other. But then, starting in 1972, for the first time, the federal government puts out, or it establishes, this Australian Council of Awards in Advanced Education, and it has a nomenclature guide. And so this is really the first time the federal government's getting into higher education. Before that, knowledge had not been an issue of the economy. The federal government, of course, collects the taxes and makes economic policy primarily. And so here we are getting universities connected to the economy through the federal government for the first time in 1972. 1972, as you can see, I'm an old woman. 1972 was the year I got my PhD. So my PhD had been, I had done my university education with the huge expansion of university education in the 1960s that happened after the war. Before that, girls from my sort of background did not get into universities. And then, so by 1972, the federal government was involved, much more money was coming in. We were getting all these interdisciplinary universities like Deakin University, and all the newer universities. By 1995, the federal government had a scale of degrees that began with the Senior Secondary School of Education, switched to the vocational education training sector, then to the higher education sector. And so 1995, the first time they have this chart, if you like, that goes from senior school to a diploma of education. So everything's scaled. It's a hierarchy. There's still considerable hierarchy as seen in the certificates. By 2011, when the latest chart comes out, it's turned into a clock face, and many more people are expected to make their way around the clock face, beginning in 1 and ending up in 10, which is a doctoral degree. So as we've gone on in the last 50 years, things have become much more administratively controlled. And so that's one periodisation of the Australian situation. There is another one, and this is one that's becoming increasingly popular recently, and that is to see the first 50 or 60 years as a colonial form of relation between the state and knowledge doing, in other words, education and research. And then from the 1970s, when like Papua New Guinea gets its independence, the Northern Territory, well, the Department of Territories, of which Papua New Guinea and the Northern Territory are the two parts, they get separated. The Northern Territory begins towards statehood, and this is considered, if you like, a post-colonial era of Australian education, which many people considered lasted till about 2015, something like that. And from then on, we find ourselves in a decolonising situation and a need to much more radically expand from, if you like, the sort of modern, or reimagine the modern cosmology. So cosmologies are beginning to come into the discussion of and different cosmologies and the different roles of knowledge. And this comes in with decolonising. But it's not only the sort of decolonising push, it's also the push, the sense that divergences, we need to learn how to do divergences, otherwise we're never going to be able to generate knowledge and the concepts and the data that we need to get a handle on climate change. So climate change and this introduction of the word Anthropocene is another, but I think rather separate momentum, beginning to really have this, cause a shift, make a difference in the way the higher education landscape, and it's a landscape that connects sort of politics and society and knowledge making. Now, I'll tend to use two different words about knowledge. I use knowledge making and doing, and I also use epistemics. So here I'm getting on to the second part of my talk, talking about concepts. And of course, these two concepts, knowledge on the one hand and epistemics on the other, they're two different concepts. And they're concepts that work slightly differently in this complex landscape of socio-political, historical, cultural, and cosmological that's coming in now. Social setting, if you like, and the way knowledge works in that. And of course, knowledge, the word knowledge, the name knowledge, that's an old English term, and it first started life in a medieval cosmology, really, and it's still got sort of got some of that hanging on to it, like and then epistemics begins in ancient Greece, and whereas knowledge might be associated with so-called Druids and Druidism, in some ways. Epistemics is associated with the rationality of the ancient Greeks. Very, very different cosmologies. And of course, knowledge and cosmologies go together. Cosmologies are sort of open stories, which are, if we want to say it philosophically, they're metaphysical commitments that we have in our knowledge, whether knowledge making and doing, whether we know it or not. So this is it's a different concept of concepts than you might have, say, learnt in primary school, which is where you first learn about concepts, the first introduced to concepts, and they're introduced as abstractions. Numbers are thought to be, exemplary of them. So I'm taking a different view of concepts. And of course, that picture of concepts as abstractions, that's associated with particular knowledge practices or particular epistemic practices. And physics, of course, is not going to give up the idea that its concepts are abstractions. So it's not that, I think the idea of concepts as abstractions is wrong. It's just bigger than that. If you're looking at concepts in this much wider sense of looking at the way knowledge works and knowledge practices work in the world, so it's just not wide enough. That's the problem. So just the collectives in which concepts have lives, and concepts do have lives, and these concepts of knowledge and epistemics, they've had really slightly wild lives in some cases. But what tends to matter with a concept is that you've got a sort of technology that you do it with. You've got a good name for it, a good a strong name, robust name, resilient name, concepts tend to proliferate as new needs are found, new work is found for them to do. So this is it's a very inclusive notion of concepts, and it sees that all cosmologies, all working cosmologies have concepts. Some people who work in some cosmologies will really opt for a really strong sense of concepts as abstract. In other working cosmologies, they're much more associated with the practices that people actually do, including the naming practices. So this, in my view, this is a concept of concepts that's becoming extremely sort of important as we try to get a handle on how to do the Anthropocene well, make good knowledge to work the Anthropocene, and how decolonising works. So we need this really wide, inclusive, resilient notion of concepts. Okay, so that's moving on to my third section. In this section, I want to talk about disciplinary epistemic practices, or disciplinary practices of making knowledge, and how they're valuable, but also interdisciplinary, which I've begun to think of as generic rather than interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary sort of doesn't really help much, I think, because people tend to go back to the disciplines, and the point is that in some real world problem, you're using concepts, and if you're, say, if you're working, say, in nanotechnology, no one actually in CDU is working in nanotechnology, but if you're working in nanotechnology trying to invent new materials, you're very likely to have various social scientists who are interested in the socio-materialities of those nanotechnology molecules and so on. And so you're working across sort of chemistry or materials, natural products chemistry, and social sciences. You're probably using the same term for concept, but you're meaning something very different. And so this is why I prefer generic than interdisciplinary, because if you say what we're doing is generic epistemic practices, you're more likely to realise, ooh, maybe the way I'm thinking of this concept is not quite the same as the way the other person is thinking of concept. And though I need my concept to work in this way, it has to connect enough with the other person's. So interdisciplinarity comes down to how you make concepts connect and separate, because you do need the connections, you do need the separations. This has always been the case, of course, in the social sciences, where scientists are using concepts that often have a sort of strong life in ordinary conversation, and social scientists use those words, which are concepts, differently. So social sciences has always been aware of this. It just becomes much more complicated when the people who you're working with and whose lives and social situations you're interested in, you're working with a lot of other scientists as well. So there's a sort of radical proliferation of slightly different meanings for any one concept in most of the work we do now. Okay, so, and most of the work that we're doing, most of the research that is funded tends to be empiricist work, empirical studies. So federal governments and those who fund knowledge doing and making these days. They're not much interested in theory making. And this really came in very strongly it came in Australia with John Howard, who said bluntly that he wasn't going to fund any more scientists to do theoretical work. What we need is more information. And this was, and this is really emphasised in the disciplines that have really thrived. Of course, philosophy is going to always do theory. Philosophy is not an empiricist discipline. And philosophy is going to stick around, there's no doubt about that. So there's always going to be some people doing theory, but whereas in a lot of social scientists used to think of themselves as doing theoretical work in the past, I think this is not the case so much anymore. And what you find is that social scientists and environmental scientists and really all scientists find themselves assembling data and working with concepts. And so it's these tensions between data and concepts that we really need to get our head around, how to do this. And the problem for people like us in regional universities is that the people who fund much of our research, like the Northern Territory government, to some extent, say mining industries, environmental organisations, they're certainly not interested in social theory or even environmental theory. But they are interested in what is increasingly called knowledge objects. So I don't know if any of you are being asked to specify as outputs the knowledge objects that your research has produced. It's increasingly common that research is expected to produce knowledge objects. So what on earth is knowledge objects? The sort of entirely new concept in this landscape. So I think of knowledge objects, if you like, as they're going to involve data and they're going to involve concepts. So say you've got a grant to study evaluation and monitoring of some environmental area that is particularly valuable. And of course, in the Northern Territory, it's very likely to be owned by particular groups of Aboriginal people, in each of those groups having different interests, as people say. I think they're different epistemic practices even. So you've got a grant to look into how this area can be monitored, and the health of this area can be monitored and evaluated both in Western scientific ways and in Aboriginal Australian ways. And of course, this involves working cosmologists together, and you need to have certain concepts and you need to get certain data. Now, of course, the data that's going to come out of Aboriginal knowledge making is going to look very different to the data that comes out of environmental science monitoring. So you've got radically different sorts of data, but you can probably agree on a concept that you want to use. So, of course, you have to make a report on this, and possibly generally in the report, you'd be content enough to put the two sorts of data in. I know that this is the way things have in the past anyway, worked in Kakadu with environmental data assembled alongside Indigenous data, mostly in the form of stories, or in the form of actually workshops on country, and so this whole idea of data expands very radically, and then probably in the report you relate these sets of data to your concept. Now that's going to work in a report, and the people who've given you the money are probably going to be very happy. You'll have photos, and you know it can be counted really successful research. But of course, since you're a researcher in a university, you also need to make a Q1 article. And how are you going to do that? And this is where you need to be able to, if you like, step back a bit from the way you've been thinking about data up to this point. Happy enough with the need to, in this case, have two different sorts of data, say, or you know, I've been using sort of socio-environmental project so far. What about if we think of a different sort of a project? And I'll stop talking soon so that we can have some questions. So if everybody can get questions about their own data and concepts ready, that would be really good. Okay, so let's think about another situation. And here I'm drawing on work I've done with a particular researcher in the Northern Institute, and thinking of workshops that are have been organised around the radically changing energy situation in Australia, and the way what needs to happen in the network. So it's a thoroughly sort of technical issue. The design of the network needs to change as more environmental friendly energy comes on board, as, say, Darwin relies less on gas and oil and more on wind and solar. So this has quite large technical demands, but it also has large social demands. So maybe you're running workshops to try to collect together the participants who have interest in this, stakeholders we call them these days, and you put a lot of effort into running these workshops, and it's rather difficult because people who think about the technical needs of the energy grid are not very good at thinking about the fact that different forms of social organisation are going to be needed different forms of risk emerge, and so on. And so communicatively, in a communication sense, it's an extremely difficult situation. But of course, people, we've been running workshops for years and years and years. We do know how to do it with lots of tricks and so on. And so the workshop happens usually fairly successfly, but of course not always. I've organised a couple of disasters, I can tell you. And then we write a report about it. This and this was discussed, consultations were made, and so on. Then so you've got a good report, you did a decent enough workshop. What can you do next? You can turn it into a Q1 article, but what's going to be your data? What concepts are you going to use? And this is where, in making that shift, and it's a shift of focus, and it's a shift of a shift in a way of thinking about what concepts are, thinking about what data is, devising new forms of data or new ways of presenting the data, and letting that data, both letting the concepts interrogate the data and letting the data interrogate the concepts, because very often what we have to work on is getting our concepts to be more resilient, more flexible, to change, so that we can get at the particular problems we need to be getting at. So the point is, we need the data, but data can be presented in many different ways, so that you can present the outcomes for a workshop, say, but you can also make a description of the happening of a workshop, and you can show how the happening actually was skewed by the way in which a particular set of interests pushed changed the agenda, actually through the content of the workshop itself. So, and that's very interesting, actually, showing the way in which the content of what you're talking about changes the way things go. So that would be that could turn into a good Q1 journal article, whereas just the report of the workshop is not going to fly anywhere. Okay, so what we need to think about, we need to become quite familiar with this idea that concepts are not just these pure abstract things, but they have lives in the world, and that we need to know something about how their lives progress and what's involved. So we need to make concepts our familiars and know how to work with them and how to expand them. And we also need to know how to sort of play with data, turn it inside out a bit, look at it from a different angle, present it differently. Okay, so well, I've been talking about the content and the way that we need to be quite sophisticated in the way we're thinking about our concepts, our content, rather. But of course, then you've got to match it. You've got to match what you want to do to make your Q1 article, to make things more interesting to a journal. And as I said in my blurb, journals they're increasingly interdisciplinary, but they tend to have disciplinary roots. And so selecting a journal is not easy, and you can sometimes have spectacular failures in having misjudged what the journal is interested, misread. So one of the things we really need to do is to learn to read our journals as such, not read the articles, read the journal. Where does the journal fit in? Where's it coming from? Who's in charge of it? What's their agenda? And so on. And I can say more about this later. So I've been talking for nearly 45 minutes now, so maybe I should stop and move on to some of the questions. So,
hi, Helen.
Hi, Katrina. Katrina's doing the questions for us.
Okay, so we do have 3 questions in, and the first one's from Deepika, and her question is, where do we get a concept from if it wasn't there in the initial report?
Yes, so this is so often what people have, the sort of question people have when I first start talking to them. And I do talk with a number of younger researchers and so on. And this question about concepts comes up. Usually people who fund our sort of workaday research are not terribly interested in concepts. They just want, I mean, you know, it really is just the facts, ma'am. That really is what they want. And by the facts, they mean just the data. You use the concepts you need and that'll be fine. And of course, you will have had some working concept in your research agenda. This is what your question is. Say if I refer to Deepika's research, it'll be about recycling or waste, building waste. And so the idea of there being building waste is already a concept, but it's quite a descriptive concept. So you'll often find that, particularly in thesis work or in reports or in organising workshops, goodness, I'm losing my words here, in organising workshops, you'll be using a concept that is fairly descriptive. Okay, so you do have a concept, it's just that it's not, it's really just bundling things together, enabling you to go and ask questions or organise discussions or collect data or whatever. So what you really need to do to get from a workaday research output to an academic article is to value add something to that concept. So in other words, you have to make it do more than just descriptively group things. This comes from being thoroughly familiar with your area. So if you're, say you're in monitoring and evaluation, and this time not of an environmental management, but of monitoring and evaluating the provision of some social service. So like I was involved with monitoring and evaluating the provision of the school holiday program in Alice Springs one year, that the government really put a lot of effort into funding an elaborate school holiday program, and a researcher in Alice Springs went round with his phone and talked to anybody who was willing to talk to him, to ask what they liked, what they didn't like, why did they come, and so on. And so we could put together some data about what sorts of programs were successful, and we made a report and so on. So how might that be turned into a Q1 article? Well, looking at the data, I found something really interesting about the way the population of young people in Alice Springs divided, and they seemed to divide in people who were static or long-term residents, if you like, settlers in Alice Springs. They lived there, and they saw the school holiday program as part of that. And then an almost equal part of the population who were accessing this project was a much more moving population, mostly Aboriginal young people coming in and out of Alice Springs. They thought Alice Springs was certainly their home, but they just were a mobile population, and one boy in particular, I remember, and he talked about, well, whether I'm in station or out station, I always play sport. So what he meant by in station was being in Alice Springs. So he had this concept of in station and out station, and that's how he lived his life. And so I could take that concept and actually work with it and say something about the population of young people in Alice Springs. Okay, so the point is to find a clue in what you've got and go from there. I don't know if that helps.
I'm sure it does. Our next question is from Simon, and his question is, what advice can you give for selecting a Q1 academic journal and then submitting an article to it?
Yes, this is always a problem, and you don't always get it right, of course. So you have to look for clues in the origins of the journal. So Q1 journals tend to be fairly well established, so they have fairly long histories. So one thing you can do is go right back to the very first edition of the journal and see what they said about themselves. See where they're coming from. And say I think if it's Simon Morris, who I think it is, he's in accountancy. Is that right, Simon?
Yes, it is Simon Morris, yes. Okay.
And accountants, so if you're, and clearly in very often accountancy is part of organisational governance. And so, and organisational governance can be related to sort of social development and so on. So, try to work out. So there'll be a your interest will fall somewhere along a wide continuum. So, but really getting the journal who are going to be interested in your particular concept. And so my feeling is that journals are much more interested, Q1 journals are much more interested in innovation in concepts, analytic concepts, pushing the boundaries of what concepts can do, and using data, using something odd in the data to push your concept. And that's what I was doing, for example, in identifying two populations of youth, of young people. I was using the data to open up something about the concept that I was using to actually group the data. So I'd say the way to get your journal would be to think about the concept first rather than the data. Think about what the data can do to make the concept interesting. A journal editor's going to prick up their ears if they see a conventional concept pushed beyond what the work it usually does. And of course, you don't want to be too wild on that. Much more so than they're going to be interested in the particular situation, say in a particular country, about the state of accountancy, education, and so on. So follow the concept when you're looking for your journal. Does that work?
I'm sure it does. Okay, Helen, now our third question. Can you hear me?
Yes, yep.
Okay, great. Is from Marla. And she says, "Hi, Helen, nice to see you. I exited with a grad cert in Indigenous knowledge, spent many years learning Gamma maths. I'm now finding myself needing to return to either a master's or PhD in a journey of restoration, for example, healing on country. So Marla's question was, how do I treat my data going from one studies onto restoration of identity into Q1 publications?
So this notion of identity, you need to think about, am I going to think about identity in a sort of quite a wide sense of social psychology, or am I going to think about identity purely from the point of view of Indigenous Australians and country? In a way, the role of country in identity, the role of place in identity is absolutely uniquely Indigenous, particularly Indigenous Australian. And you could think, okay, maybe I'm going to take what I've learned about this form of identity and offer, you could say, a critique, or offer to push this social psychology notion of identity. So you'd have to be very brave. You have to read up a lot about social psychology, and it's rather limited and very, if you like, identity in a different cosmology. So it depends how brave you want to be, Marla, and how much work. But I think that the continual work of those of us who have been, if you like, systematically educated, trained, sensitised by Aboriginal Australians, and very fortunate we are to experience this, using that to shift what's often called the mainstream, make a difference in the mainstream. That is one way you can think about what you're doing. So my suggestion is get hold of a big picture of what you want to do. Then find a journal that might be interested in this. And in this case, it would probably be an open access journal. And open access journals very often are not Q1 because they're only just now, all the citation indexes are only just now learning how to deal with open access journals. But find a Q1 journal that does do open access and really try to read some articles in that journal that you think seem to be useful and or speak to your problems, and then see how you can speak back. So in that case, I would look for the journal first, and see which journals are likely to be interested in what you can make from this data. And in this case, you wouldn't be following the concept. You'd be thinking, looking at the journal, thinking, oh, that could be a useful concept, and going that way. So I hope that helps.
Okay, and we have our last question because we're going a little over time, and this is from Luciana. Would it be suitable to view the data, i.e. qualitative, from a certain methodology or theoretical framework, e.g. self-efficacy, social cognitive theory, and write a journal article based on the application of that to the data, even if the initial data collection was not designed to ask about that specifically? Thank you in advance.
Yes, I think that is very interesting, a very interesting way to do it. If you're to, and of course, what you need to understand to do that is that concepts and the relation between concepts and theories. A lot of people think that, concepts and theories are sort of really strongly connected together. No, they're not. Concepts don't owe anything to theories, and neither does data. So it is very open. I would get very familiar with the other theory first of all. I would actually I would try and voice it to someone who would listen, and this is where a mentor comes in, of course. If you take the different theory, find a few analytic concepts that really speak to your data, and they may have the same name as the one you already used in assembling the data under a different theory, method and the view of knowledge that implied, and try to first of all tell it. Now, this sounds silly, but if you can learn to say it, or if you can work out how to say it, you're much further ahead. And this is where teaching, the way in which teaching and research used to always go together, and it doesn't now, unfortunately. And so we've lost this, we've lost the opportunity of giving lectures and giving tutorials in particular to actually push things. So teaching undergraduates I used to always try my concepts out first on my undergraduates and see how they worked, because as you voice it, so that's my suggestion if you want to go that way, is do it. It's certainly feasible, and you don't have to sort of announce in the article, oh, this data was assembled using a different analytic or organising concept. No apologies necessary. So yeah, do have a go at it, and if you think I can help, do sort of send me an email. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And as I said, if you'd like to contact Helen, her email address is in the chat, and you can always find that on our website. And I also want to make you aware that Helen runs our Espresso Yourself virtual coffee shop for research students, which happens on the fourth Wednesday of every month. The details of that are also on our website. So if you just go to cdu.edu.au/Northern-Institute, you'll be able to find us. And I think that's about it. Thank you very much, Helen. I appreciate it.
Thank you.